The world didn't end with an all-consuming nuclear war as many people feared it would. That might have been better than what actually happened. At least with the nuclear war, there was hope, a very slim hope, of survival. I fear there is no surviving this, though. In the upper echelons of the government, the people in charge of making life and death decisions thought it was a wiser course of action to use bioweapons. Don't poison the earth, just the people. And that was the propaganda they poured out to the public here in the US. And once the threats of a bio-attack were in the news here, other countries joined, threatening the use of their own bioweapons. Widespread panic engulfed the world, and protests popped up everywhere, in every town. It was the most united I had ever seen the citizens of the US, and I was proud to be among the protesters, making my opinion heard. In those crowds of like-minded people, one voice could be multiplied until the sentiment was heard worldwide. The news coverage was constant. Like many others, I really believe the government was listening to us. Not just here, but in all the other countries too. The threats of war were slowly and reluctantly replaced with truces. Treaties were created, new documents signed into law, and a hush fell over the land about bio-attacks. As the representatives of different governments pandered to the public, told us what we wanted to hear, we were persuaded to stop the protests and go back to life as usual. Had I looked more closely at those televised handshake sessions, I might have seen the lie in their eyes. I might have been more prepared. But I didn't see the lies, and I, like the rest of the population, was not prepared. Now the bio-attack came to fruition over several months, as the various viral outbreaks made people sick, and eventually killed almost all the victims. And by the time I realized that the bio-war had taken place, it was far too late to help most people. In my town, a new strain of flu quickly became an epidemic. We heard the warnings on TV one day, and 2 days later, businesses, schools, and public works were shut down, and the place looked like a ghost town. After a few days of sitting at home, waiting for the flu epidemic to clear up in my town, I finally started calling neighbors, friends, and family. To my horror, every person that answered the phone that day reported at least one death in their circle of friends and family. Many of the people I called didn't even answer their phones, so I left messages and waited a day before I started to panic. I started packing a go bag. I didn't know exactly where I would go. The viruses were everywhere. Hoping against hope that the sickness would start to clear up, I remained at home a few more days. I stopped seeing any movement from my neighbors' houses. No animals, no people. And only a few birds remained. The news reporters were even showing signs of illness, but they still worked to give us the latest reports about what was going on in the world. On the 7th day after the new flu shut down my town, I watched the news. Bella Morley, pretty little blonde who gave the weather forecast with a big smile every day, collapsed between the New York City and the Atlantic City forecast. And that's the day I decided to get to my family's property, 100 miles away. The news reports I had watched in the previous days had all advised the public to remain in their homes, and I had done that. I didn't want to be around anyone with the flu and risk getting sick, but after Bella dropped on set, I knew this was much worse than anything that had ever happened before. I loaded everything I thought I might need into my truck and then secured a tarp over it all. And as I went back inside for my last pack, my cell phone rang. I'd not been able to use my phone for the last 24 hours, but it turned out to be my buddy Ryan. He and I graduated from the same college as engineers the year before. He asked if I was sick, and I told him no. He wasn't sick either, but said that everyone in the suburbs where he lived was dead, including all their pets. He hadn't been able to get a hold of his family, who lived in the same general direction as mine, and I told him to come over and we would go together, stopping at his parents' house first. I put the TV back on the news station and sat with a beer, watching as the local anchor coughed and constantly dabbed at his forehead with the handkerchief. He kept apologizing, and after 15 minutes, I realized there had been no commercial breaks. After half an hour of no commercials, Bob, the anchorman, cleared his throat and said, "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but there is no one left alive here. I'm the last. I'm dying too. I can feel it. If you're watching this, find a place where the viruses can't travel and stay there. I'm going home now. I don't want to go out like Bella in front of the cameras. Good luck and God bless." With that, he stood and staggered off camera, and I was left staring at his empty seat as it spun on its swivel for several seconds. Then there was nothing but the empty news desk and chairs. I switched channels and found that only channels that had pre-programming were still on the air. No news, nothing live, no streaming internet channels. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all the other social media sites were eerily silent and still. It was as creepy to me as being in a school at night when no one was there. There were places where there was supposed to be activity, people, drama, and there was nothing. Ryan arrived on foot. He told me that the roads were crammed with vehicles and bodies. He was pale and glassy-eyed as he told me of his journey to my house. As we left, we quickly ran into one of the roads blocked by vehicles. Neither of us got out to examine the few bodies we saw on the sidewalks and in cars. Fear that my family might be dead turned into terror as I maneuvered off the road and onto the rougher terrain of the land. I drove through yards with gut-wrenching feeling of guilt. I mean, you're not supposed to drive through people's yards. It's just wrong. But I soon realized that nothing would ever be normal again. Ever. Outside town limits, I was able to get back on the road. It was a 2-lane that twisted and turned, slowing our progress. At the bottom of the mountain lay another town, and I stopped at the convenience store for gas. The store was open, but there were no people present. I asked Ryan to go in with me and we both entered, expecting to find bodies littering the floor. There was nothing. The radio was on behind the counter and there was no music, only static. I turned on the gas pump and Ryan carried cases of water to the truck. The whole time we were there, he carried things he thought we might need and kept telling me that this was the end. Everyone was dead. He worked himself into a frenzy. Quite honestly, got on my nerves. I wanted to fill my gas tank and get out of there. I didn't want to think about the possible end of the world. Getting control of himself, Ryan finally quieted. He sat silently staring out at the road as I drove away, and Ryan flipped the radio on. Static blared out of the speakers. There were no stations on air. He pulled out a cell phone, held it up, and stuck it out the window, pulled it in close, and then told me that there was no signal. I checked my phone, it was the same. And as we neared the end of the town, we began to see more and more vehicles on the road, and I had to swerve off the side and drive through a large field. I didn't see any people inside the cars or lying around, as I had in my town. And the road in this part of the new town was not like the main street in my town where businesses lined each side. The road stretched through an empty landscape, devoid of houses and buildings for a couple of miles. "Ryan, where do you think they all went?" He shook his head and shrugged without speaking. The absence of bodies bothered me worse than seeing the corpses. At least when I saw the corpses, it was obvious that people had died in their cars, leaving the road blocked. If people were sick enough to be dying suddenly like that, then where were their bodies? The nearest hospital or clinic was at least 2 miles away. If they were so sick, they wouldn't have been able to walk there. But if they were dead, where were the bodies? We continued to the neighborhood where Ryan's family lived. As I drove, I had to maneuver up onto sidewalks and avoid random cars. And again, there still weren't any bodies. We had seen no animals either, and it felt as if we were inside an episode of The Twilight Zone. I parked in the driveway outside the Hendersons' house and looked at Ryan, and I asked if he wanted me to go in with him, and he nodded. I didn't want to go into the house. Hell, I didn't want to get out of the truck. And as we walked toward the front door, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye and grabbed Ryan's arm to stop him. I pointed toward the backyard. There was a young girl ambling away from us. Her hair was straggly, her dress was dirty, and her hands looked to be coated in filth. Ryan moved toward the open gate. I tried to stop him, but he pulled free and continued. He spoke to the girl, calling her Caroline, and I knew this to be the name of his only niece. As she turned to face us, my heart fell into my knees. Her face was gray, eyes black, and blood was smeared across her cheek where it was starting to dry. She snarled like an animal at Ryan, and he stood there, eyes big, mouth hanging open. I bolted for the open gate, pushing Ryan out of the way as I pulled it shut just before the little girl hit it, thrashing and growling, reaching towards him. Ryan didn't want to leave Caroline there, but I got him to see that something was very wrong with her. We just couldn't pick her up and carry her out of there. And Caroline continued to scream and thrash at the fence, and I hurried Ryan onto the porch and into the house. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary inside. Then, we went to his parents' bedroom. His father lay sprawled on his back on the floor. His throat had been ripped out. His face was twisted into a visage of terror and pain. In one fist, he had a strip of ripped cloth with a distinct paisley pattern on it. The blood and viscera was on the floor, bed, and the bottom of the closet wall, and even the bottom drawer of the dresser across the room. Ryan cried out at the sight of his father. God, it was such a terrible sound, so full of grief that it tore at my heart. I pulled the quilt from the bed and laid it over Mr. Henderson's body. I pulled Ryan to his feet, telling him we needed to get the hell out of there. In the hallway, still trying to quiet Ryan, I saw the most horrible thing I'd seen so far. Mrs. Henderson, dressed in a heavily soiled paisley print dress. She stepped out of Ryan's old room. Her face was gray and her eyes were black, just like little Caroline. She was gnawing on a small arm. Part of her cheek had been torn away, but that didn't seem to faze her or slow down her ripping the flesh of the severed arm. A large piece of her dress was missing at the bottom. She didn't scream or growl when she saw us. Instead, she dropped the arm to the carpet and began to advance slowly, a piece of bloody flesh dangling from her mouth as she continued to chew. I understood that Mrs. Henderson had probably killed everyone else in the house, and I had no desire to look into more rooms. Ryan was useless, standing silent and staring at his mother, or what had once been his mother. She moved closer and reached out for Ryan. The hallway was skinny, but I yanked Ryan away from those reaching fingers and stepped in front of him. And out of sheer panic and not knowing what else to do, I shoved Mrs. Henderson into the room where her dead husband lay, and I slammed the door shut. I yelled at Ryan to get back to the truck, and I followed closely as he ran out of the house. Briefly looking back, in the backyard, I saw that Caroline had been back to shuffling idly through the grass. Our next stop was the police station. We had hoped to find a CB radio to use so we could find out if there were others alive in the surrounding area. Unfortunately, there was nothing left but a burnt-out husk of the station, and in the ruins we saw a couple of burned bodies. Ryan asked me not to stop to investigate, so we continued to my parents' home, a few miles away. Although the house was only a few miles away, the drive was long, and I had time to consider what I would do if my family had suffered the same fate as Ryan's. I knew how I hoped I would react, but I was realistic enough to know I couldn't be certain. The house finally came into view, and the first thing I saw was the shattered picture window of the living room. A white curtain sheer flapped out of that window like a white flag of surrender in the strong breeze. My father passed the broken window as I pulled up close. He was dragging something past the sofa. I saw a foot in his hand, and I didn't need to go inside to know that he had probably killed my mother. He looked like Ryan's mother had looked. I didn't even stop in there. I just turned around and sped out the driveway, biting back the sobs. About 10 miles away from there, we found a deserted shopping center and parked in the center of the paved lot. I had to figure out the next step. Ryan and I bounced ideas off each other for a few minutes. We decided that we could climb to the top of the shopping center and enter through the service crawl space. At least we'd be safe inside. And there would be enough food for however long we might stay. You think this is how it is? Is this how the world ends? Ryan asked as we broke into the service crawl space. No, there has to be others. We're alive, so I'm sure others are too. We just have to figure out how to find them. I headed in first and Ryan followed. What about those, you know, the thing my mother turned into? Ryan dropped from the crawl space down into a long silver table in the kitchen, and we walked into a food court. Zombies, Ryan. Might as well call it what it is. No matter what caused them to turn, they're zombies. I didn't like using the word either, but there it was. No other word fit. We spent a total of 3 days in the shopping center, neither of us knowing what to do next. I think I had half-assed hope that the situation was just going to disappear on its own, or maybe that others like us would just pop up and we, as a group, could band together and figure it out. On the 4th day, I realized that we had to establish some form of communication with the wider world. I told Ryan my thoughts. I had grown up in the general area and knew there was an isolated radio station at the base of a mountain nearby. No radio stations played any music, only static. If we could get to the radio station, we could go live and maybe someone would hear us. And at first, Ryan was completely against the idea of leaving the safety of the store, and I told him that it was unlikely that others would come by. No one had so far, and the only living people who hadn't turned into monsters had become food for the monsters. It took some persuasion, but he agreed to go with me, help me restore some form of communication so we could figure out what we should do next. We found keys at the security office and didn't have to break any glass to get out. If things got worse, we could always come back, and it would still be safe. About 2 miles from the radio station, I had to go off-road to proceed again. And this time, there were a few bodies, but they looked as if they'd been torn to shreds. Arms and legs lay strewn on the roadway and in the grass. I saw a woman's head lying against the back tire of an old Chevy. My stomach turned and I forced myself to look away. Now about halfway across the field, I hit a ravine that was hidden by the tall grass. The jolt was so hard that it threw me into the steering wheel, busting my lip. It was as if the world had dropped out from under us. The engine stalled and wouldn't start up again. We got out and saw that both front tires were flat, and a long, sharp rock formation had struck through the middle of my radiator. With no way to fix the radiator, we just started walking. Let me tell you, it was scary that we were so close to all those mangled bodies. And the sun was scorching us as we walked, and within 10 minutes we saw a movement to our left, far over in the shady woods. We called out, thinking it was probably other survivors walking off the mountain, even after the small group emerged and started towards us in the sunlight. We thought they were survivors. By the time we realized that they were zombies, they were a couple 100 feet from us, and they were moving fast. Not the shambling monsters from the movies. Ryan dropped his pack and broke into a run. I followed. We ran until we had outdistanced the monsters by several 100 feet, and they seemed to lose track of us. Maybe they were guided by their sense of smell or hearing. I didn't know. I still don't. There was a small patch of woods separating where we were in the field to where the radio station sat. The shade felt good after the blistering heat of running in the open field. We thought we could slow down and catch our breath for a few minutes, but we were wrong. Just as the virus didn't kill every infected person, it didn't kill all the exposed animals either. As Ryan and I walked into the forested area, we heard growling, and we stopped. A deer stalked out of the shadows. We knew it had changed. Its dark eyes pierced my soul, and the doe's face was covered with blood. Pieces of gore and hair were stuck to its front hooves. Something larger trampled in the forest debris behind the deer. The deer didn't seem to notice and walked towards us, growling low. I told Ryan to run, and we headed to the right with the deer gaining on us easily. Ryan fell, and I tried to drag him to safety, but the deer was on us, slashing at us with its hooves. I tried to hit it with my pack, but the blows didn't hurt it or alter its attack on us, and the deer hit Ryan across the forearm, cutting him to the bone. Ryan's scream was bone-chilling, and the deer snapped its jaws as it dipped its head toward the bloody arm. And all of a sudden, the deer flew to the side in a blur of black fur before it could latch its teeth onto Ryan's arm. The black bear that downed the deer ripped into the animal with a ferocity that I'd never seen before. Ryan scrambled to his feet and ran, and I lit out of those woods faster than I'd ever ran before, the sounds of the vicious attack behind me. We cleared the field in record time and were exhausted by the time the radio station came into view. I immediately took off my shirt and told Ryan to wrap his arm with it, and he wrapped it as we walked to the radio station. The radio station was a short, squat, one-story brick building that had mostly been taken over by the Virginia creeper vines. The radio station was a short, squat, one-story brick building that had mostly been taken over by Virginia creeper vines. The entrance door was partially hidden behind the vine, and I was more than willing to endure the itchy, burning rash to get inside the building, safely away from the zombie animals and the people outside. As I reached for the door handle, the vines closest to me moved toward my hand. Startled, I jumped back, expecting some zombie bird or squirrel to emerge and attack me. No animal leaped from the foliage, and I reached for the door again. A wide swath of the vine moved toward my hand. Ryan and I checked for another entrance, and found only one more door was completely covered in the vines. The windows were also inaccessible. Ryan said, "Well, it is just a vine. It can't be that tough to tear through, and, well, it doesn't have any teeth." And I agreed with him. I reached for the door handle again, and immediately the vine snapped around my hand and arm and started spiraling up around my torso. Ryan began ripping them away, and I yanked the door open and darted inside. Ryan slammed the door shut behind us. After cleaning and dressing Ryan's maimed arm, we set to work restoring communication capabilities in the station. For a couple of educated engineers, we might not have much knowledge and skill against the zombie apocalypse, but we had made short work of putting the radio station back to rights and sending out messages across every local channel. We will have the means to send messages further in a day or so, and hopefully There are others who survived and are unaffected by the viral outbreak, and they can hear our messages and perhaps answer. But our problems are far from over. We need food and water. Our supplies are minimal and won't last us a week. The truck is 2 miles away, and I really don't think we can make it back to the supplies safely. We won't lose hope, though. We can't. It's all we have left. I knew something was wrong as soon as my little town closed the schools and public works. Then, when the smiling anchorman and woman kept repeating that everything was okay, all the while wearing their "I'm lying through my teeth" smiles, I was absolutely convinced. All those treaties and truces hadn't meant shit. We'd have been hit with bioweapons. Almost a week after the pretty little blonde died while giving the weather forecast for the East Coast, I began to see and hear the zombie activity outside my house. I didn't go outside. My food supply was running out. I knew I would eventually have to go out there. From the relative safety of my house, I watched the horror movie play out as my neighbors attacked each other, as their dead bodies reanimated, as the animals became zombies, and I wished for something between me and them that was more substantial than my wooden plaster walls. I never looked out the windows downstairs, only the ones upstairs where I wouldn't be too close to the milling abominations. I had to distance myself from it or risk going mad. Everything I saw, I learned from. Noise seemed to draw their attention. They attacked blindly. They even attacked inanimate objects, if they bumped into them. I watched a dog attack a chain-link fence, ripping out its own teeth as it tried to chew through it. And I watched a woman throw herself against the back window of a sheriff's van until her head split open and she smashed the exposed brain until she fell to the ground and lay there motionless. No, they didn't get back up. Their heads were too damaged. And they didn't attack each other either. The zombies only attacked non-zombies, or vice versa in the few instances I saw. People who had not turned attacking zombies, killing as many possible before being overrun by them. So I gathered up my machete, rifle, ammo, baseball bat, and I had 1 can of golden sweet whole kernel corn left in my cabinet. And I hadn't seen another living person in 3 days. Only the birds that fed on corpses seemed normal. Everyone else and all the animals had turned by then. There were fewer zombies outside by then too, but even one was too many. At least in my opinion. I started out on the street, marking my path in my mind. 2 blocks straight ahead, left on Airedale Road, Big Dale's grocery on the left. I looked to my stash of weapons. Each seemed inadequate. If I was cornered somehow by a crowd of them, I would soon tire from swinging the bat or the machete. The gun would eventually need to be reloaded, and I didn't know how many zombies were up there, 2 blocks away. There could be hundreds up next to Big Dale's grocery. Most likely they were inside the store too. And the gun would do no good in close quarters. I would have to rely on the machete or the bat. I counted 12 zombies still in sight. None of them were close to the street I had to take. I knew it was my chance, so I grabbed the backpack from the hall closet, the machete and the bat. Then I headed down the stairs. My heart pounded as I opened my front door slowly. Stepping onto the porch, I closed the door noiselessly and surveyed the streets. It looked as if most of the zombies had moved down the street to the left of my house. That was good. And I made my way to the sidewalk. The only sound, other than the wind, was my heart hammering behind my ears. And I moved slowly, always watchful as I entered yards along the street, using bushes and trees to conceal myself when possible. 2 blocks went by faster than I had thought they would, and I stood at the corner of Main and Airedale. I could just see the parking lot and the lower corner of Big Dale's. My stomach rumbled at the thought of being so close to food. I saw no movement except for a couple of dogs that had turned. They were in a fenced lot halfway between me and the store. And there was little cover on the road and a small creek separating the parking lot from the road. The entrance was farther up the road, and I couldn't see that far. I'll run across the road, go over the bank, and cross the creek. The dogs won't see me and I could come back the same way. A zombie lumbered across the road in the direction I had just come. It turned and started moving in my direction. I froze. If I engaged it, the noise would draw the others. If I ran, it might give chase and still draw the attention of the others. How many were close but hidden from view by the houses or vehicles? I just had no idea. And finally, when there was only the big evergreen bush between us, I broke into a sprint toward the creek, and I didn't dare look back. I plunged down the bank, falling and sliding on my right leg all the way to the water. The bank had been much steeper than I had counted on. I jumped to my feet, machete in one hand, bat in the other, and faced the incline. After a few seconds, I decided the zombie hadn't noticed me or hadn't followed me for whatever reason. I turned, crossed the creek, and began climbing the opposite bank. It was steeper than I thought, too. The climb was difficult, and the tall grass made my progress slow because I kept on slipping. I stayed close to the fence and the little wooded area as I walked toward the delivery entrance of the store, and I ran under the bay door, and as I stood there, someone grabbed me from behind, clamping a hand over my mouth and dragging me backwards. In my ear, a man said, "Shh, there's too many." Another man appeared and pointed toward the glass wall to my right, and the man holding me let go. The aisles were packed with zombies. I gawked in disbelief. One of the men tapped my arm and I turned. His name was Ray Bonner. I'd known him all my life. I mean, we weren't friends per se, but we were acquaintances. He held a finger to his lips when he saw the recognition on my eyes, and I nodded. We shook hands. The other man, well, I didn't know him. Ray motioned for me to follow him. We walked into the woods a few hundred feet before he introduced the other man as Ace. It was his nephew. They were looking for food, too. Ray urged us to keep moving as we talked. The wooded area wasn't very large, and there was a convenience store not far out the other side. We would check for food there. When we got there, the store was locked down tight. Before I could stop him, Ace shot the door with his shotgun. I screamed at him, "That's going to draw him here," and I pushed him aside as I bolted into the building through the now glassless door. I put my bat and machete on the counter, unshouldered my pack, and filled it with as much convenience store junk food as I could. Ray grabbed the bag and filled it with drinks from the cooler. Ace filled a milk crate with beef jerky. We were out of the store in less than a minute, and it was none too soon. A group of zombies was headed for the store, and we ran in the opposite direction and they gave chase. They didn't shamble along slowly either. Those suckers ran. Now Ray was pissed. He was screaming at Ace, "You stupid son of a bitch." Ray ran into a field surrounded by a high chain-link fence. There were government signs all over it. No admittance. Property of the United States government. No trespassing. Ray threw the bag over and climbed the fence with ease and grace that made me jealous, actually. I threw my bag over and he screamed for us to hurry. I dropped to the other side and grabbed my bag and weapons. Ace had more trouble. One of the zombies had closed the gap and was clawing at Ace's leg. He did make it over to us, but with a bloody ankle. The zombie thrashed and flailed against the fence, but didn't even attempt to climb it, and that provided a measure of relief. There was an old underground facility from the 1940s on the property. None of us had ever been there, but everyone knew about it. We could hide out there and maybe outlast the zombies, not have to fight them. It all depended on the food supply. Who knew what the military had been using the place for in all the years after World War II was over? But maybe they had kept their provisions up to date. We agreed that the perimeter fence would have to be checked. If there were holes in the fence, we would repair them and keep the property clear. First, we headed to the sloped concrete entrance to the facility. The guard lay dead in the little guard shack. Still attached to his side was a large ring of keys. A button on the panel in front of him unlocked the thick entrance doors. They were blast-proof. Concrete in the middle, lined with lead and then steel. They opened surprisingly easy. Ace took the keys, gagging as he unclipped them from the dead guy's belt loop. Thankfully, that guard hadn't turned into a zombie. He was a big man and would have been hard to stop. I made a shushing gesture at Ace as we entered the facility. The dank and musty smell I had anticipated was absent. There was the odor of decay, though, and that was far worse. That meant there had been people in here. Those people were now dead or had turned. There were 2 zombies in the shadows of that first room. They wore U.S. Army uniforms. Ray motioned for me to give the bat to Ace. The guards faced us and advanced immediately. Ray used the butt of his gun to bludgeon one guard, and Ace froze. His eyes were large, and his mouth hung open as the other guard grabbed for him. I sidestepped and swung the machete as hard as I could. The guard's head flew to the side and his body hit the floor. The mouth still worked, and the black eyes rolled in their sockets. Brackish, stinking fluid oozed from his wounds. Ace raised his foot and stomped on his head. Let me tell you, it exploded like a half-rotten cantaloupe, spraying our feet and shins with bits and pieces of brain and bone. We moved deeper into the facility. Tunnels led off in different directions. The larger tunnels were lined with doors. Most were marked only with letters and number combinations painted plainly in the center of them. The tunnel we took widened out and opened into a large room filled with miscellaneous small equipment like bobcats and ditch witches. There were a few small trucks and 2 ATVs. There was movement in the shadows that alerted us that we weren't alone. We set down our convenience store junk food and raised our weapons. 3 men and 3 dogs, all zombies, stepped out from behind the trucks and equipment, blocking our way. Ace turned to run back out of the room, and his gasp drew my attention. There were other zombies moving in from that direction to block our retreat. "Ace," I said, keeping my eyes on the advancing monsters. Yeah? I think it would be okay to use that damned shotgun now." All of the zombies broke into a run at the same time, heading straight for us. Ace screamed as the shotgun blast nearly deafened us. Ray used his rifle, taking out 2 of the dogs and 1 guard. Then they were on us. Too terrified to scream, I swung the machete, severing body parts and stepping backwards until my back was against the wall. The shotgun blasts kept exploding in my ears, and the zombies kept coming. A man flew into me, crushing me against the cold concrete wall with his rotting, foul body, his teeth snapping at my face. I managed to get the blade between our faces, and he gnashed his teeth against it. We fought until I had his back against the wall, and then I shoved that blade forward with all my weight behind it, and it didn't stop until it hit the concrete. The life slipped slowly from the ebony eyes as the bottom jaw slid to the ground with the rest of the body, and the top portion of the head fell forward, landing between the legs of its owner. And it was over. We were still alive, covered in gore and physically exhausted. We hurried out of the room. We shut the door behind us, hoping all the zombies had descended into that room during the chaos. It was then we noticed that the communications room was on the left. 2 long windows looked into the room from the tunnel. The glass was the kind that had chicken wire in it to prevent anyone from smashing in and entering. The rows of ancient computers and radios in pristine condition made it feel as if we had stepped back in time. We locked ourselves in the communications room and rested for a while. I used my shirt to wipe the gore from my face and hands so that I could eat and drink. And Ray messed with the shortwave radios for a few minutes. Maybe an hour passed. The longer I stayed in that room, the less I wanted to leave it again. But we still needed to find food and another exit. The farther we moved into the facility, the safer we felt. The air smelled cleaner, and we heard no sounds other than our own noises. The cafeteria, like the communications room, had 2 large windows with the same kind of glass. We didn't see anything in there but tables, chairs, the entrance to the kitchen, and, hopefully, led to the pantry. With a false sense of security firmly wrapped around us, we entered the cafeteria and headed for the kitchen in the back of it. Now, Ace and Ray were joking about the MREs we would find and how they would still be good even if they were 100 years old. I didn't hear the movement until the creature was on us. A big guy in cook's whites snatched Ace, dragged him backwards, and tore out part of his stomach. He dropped him to the floor and grabbed for me. I ducked, rolling under a table, knocking pots and pans to the floor. Ray raised his rifle and shot the big guy between the eyes. We ran to Ace. Part of his guts were on the floor beside him, and he sobbed as he tried to put them back in. Ray leaned down and told the boy that he loved him, kissed him on the forehead. As he pulled away, the crack of the rifle shot stunned me. He just shot his own nephew. I knew he couldn't survive the wounds, but damn. I couldn't have done it. And, well, I didn't even know the kid. Ray didn't speak, just turned and walked toward the back of the kitchen and into the huge food storage area. There was enough canned food there to last about a year, and it was all still in date. There were so many MREs that we could have spent days counting them. So, we were good on food for the foreseeable future. Ray didn't look at Ace as we headed back toward the communications room. He turned on a transistor radio and scanned the stations until he found one, broadcasting a message. There were at least 2 other survivors in a town not far away. They had holed up in an old radio station. We took down the address and other info. We would decide whether to go there after we had recuperated. It was shortly after that that I fell asleep, and I woke with a pounding headache. Ray wasn't in the room, and I panicked a little. Easing down the hall, I found him in the cafeteria, covering Ace with a white plastic sheet. He had filled a duffel bag with MREs and some canned food. He grabbed it, shouldered it, and pointed down another tunnel. I think there's an exit up here, Just had to get supplies and keys from Mace. His voice cracked and his breath hitched, but he didn't shed a tear. The door at the end of the tunnel was an exit. It led out the far end of the property. The radio station should be that way. It might take us 12 hours or so to get there on foot through the woods. I figured we'd better start early. I nodded my agreement and we walked to the perimeter fence. A large old tree had taken down a 12-foot section. 4 hours into our hike, I heard a sound I'll never forget. The sound of a mountain lion, and it was right above us. We dropped everything and backed away. Looking up, Ray raised his gun, and the mountain lion leaped. The gun went off. Ray screamed as the animal took him down. I hacked at it with the machete, but it only made its attacks on Ray more brutal. Ray screamed, "Shoot it!" as the thing pulled the meat from his arm, blood flying in every direction. I shot it in the head and it fell sideways off Ray, and I dropped to my knees. Part of his cheek had been flayed. His scalp had been pulled down over his left ear, exposing his skull, and one of his eyes was gone. The meat had been stripped from his elbow to his wrist, and it hung in a big fat flap, and his shoulder had been mauled. Blood bubbled into his mouth, and he spurted. "Shoot me in the head." And I shook my head and started to back away. "I can't." His good arm shot out and he grabbed my arm. "Don't you dare. Let me turn. Fucking shoot me in the head." His one good eye bulged. I nodded. I stood with the barrel against his forehead. My entire body was one giant knotted muscle. He grabbed the barrel and glared up at me, still gurgling blood. "Fucking do it," he said. Closing my eyes, I pulled that fucking trigger. It took me a long time to gather up the duffel bag and his extra ammo, but I did it. I want to survive. I want to live. There are other survivors out there. We would meet up and maybe straighten out this mess. I'm headed to the radio tower. I knew the general direction of the radio station, and I walked and tried not to think too much about what I'd had to do to Ray. Twice I stopped to puke at the memory. My survival instinct kicked in about 5 hours later as I walked to the edge of an open, flat field. I had to get to shelter soon. The sun was dropping low against the mountains, and the eerie reddish glow it cast over the field was unsettling. But there was a building in the distance, on the other side of that field. If I could get there safely, it might be safe to stay in overnight. The stealthy movements in the woods behind me sent shivers up my spine. Zombie animals were stalking through the shadows, and I didn't want to run in with any of them. The field looked deserted, so I set out at a fast-paced walk, constantly scanning the landscape for signs of danger. The building turned out to be a little mom-and-pop general store, and it was locked up tight. 2 corpses lay in the gravel parking lot. They had been ripped to shreds. I peeked in the windows hoping to find a way inside that didn't include breaking out the glass. Movement toward the back of the store, at the drink cooler, caught my eye. I watched for a minute. It was a young woman. She had not been turned. I pecked on the glass. and she spun toward me, dropping the bottle she had just taken from the cooler. Her eyes were wide with fear as she spotted me. I waved, gently tapped on the glass for her to please let me in. Now eyeing me suspiciously, she made her way to the door. "Have you been bitten? Attacked?" she asked me. "I'm clean." I crossed my heart and made the Boy Scout sign. She squinted at me through the murky film on the glass. There were shuffling noises behind me, and I turned, my heart falling with dread. An older man and young boy were making their way through the lot. The boy's leg was bloody, and he dragged his foot as he walked. They waved, the older man calling out, "Jesse and Max here. We're clean. He fell and cut his leg on the car in the junkyard. We need shelter for the night. Please." Max looked like a fellow who could take care of himself in a scrape. He had a sword strapped to his back, and the neon green handle showed up starkly against his dark hair. The girl in the store backed away from the door and reappeared, pointing a shotgun at me. She pointed to Max and Jesse, shook her head, and took a step back. "Please, don't leave us out here." "He said the boy was clean. It was an accident, not an attack that cut his leg. Plus, it's getting dark." I pleaded with her, trying to appeal to her nurturing side and hoping like hell she had one still. Max and Jesse stood beside me. Max lifted Jesse's leg to the window so that she could see it was indeed a clean cut from his knee to mid-calf. She lowered the gun and after another long moment of consideration, opened the door, ushering us inside. Locking the door behind us in a matter-of-fact tone, she said, "If he starts changing, I'll shoot him in the head without hesitation." Then, she walked to the cooler and took out another bottle, walked to the back room, and sat with her shotgun across her lap. I admired her for her stoicism. I felt anything but stoic under the circumstances. Telling someone I would shoot their kid just wasn't in me, I guess. It was good that someone in the little troop was that hard, I suppose, even if it was just a store clerk who looked as if she could have graced the supermodel scene. Max gave her a hard look and took Jesse to the little kitchen to clean and bandage his leg. The kid looked like he was about 11 or 12, and he only made eye contact with me once. I smiled at him, and he looked quickly back to the floor as they passed me. I grabbed the cold water and then went to the back room. The clerk sat drinking her water, staring at the blank canvas of the wall. I sat on a rickety chair and propped my arms on the table. "I'm Steven, but everyone calls me Shrews." I extended my hand. She scowled at me, then at my hand, and looked away. I get it. Not in a social mood right now. I guess that's okay. I just thought it'd be nice to get to know one another a little bit, considering we're the only people around for what seems to be miles. I stood and pushed the chair to the table. Without turning, she said, "Tracy. Everyone just calls me Tracy." "Well, it's good to meet you, Tracy." I left her alone. It was obvious that she didn't want to be bothered. Max had wrapped a towel around Jesse's leg and put freezer tape around it to hold it in place. Most of the bleeding stopped within a short while. Max was more talkative than Tracy, and Jesse was completely and utterly silent. The kid never even whimpered. I thought he was probably in shock, and no telling what he had seen. I told Max about the two men in the radio station, and he said he knew it well enough to get us there. It would take a while, but we could make it, he thought. Tracy joined us around midnight, seemingly in a more social mood. Not much, but enough that I told her about the radio station and our plan to go there the next day. She was not happy about it. She said that walking all that way would surely get us killed, especially with a kid in tow. "Well, we don't have to walk all that way," I said. "There are 2 bodies in the parking lot and 3 cars. I'm sure at least one of those cars belonged to one of those corpses. We'll take a car from here." She looked surprised, I didn't even think of that, or it would have been gone when they first showed up. She shook her head and started for the back room again. Whatever. I'm exhausted. I'll see you guys at sunrise. Max and I slept in shifts. I took the first shift. 3 hours later, I woke Max and I dozed fitfully through the remainder of the night. We let Tracy and Jesse sleep undisturbed. It was quiet outside when I got up and started planning our trip. There were no zombies of any kind roaming around, and, well, that was a good sign. I marked our route on a map and left it on the counter. I really didn't want to go outside and fish around in the pockets of dead people for car keys, but it had to be done. Putting on a brave face, I eased outside with Max watching my back from the doorway. Luckily, one of the dead guys had hooked his keys onto his belt loop, and I didn't even have to dig through his pockets. Fighting the urge to gag, I held my breath and unclipped them. Trying them in the first car's ignition, I frowned. It was a big old Chevy, and it would have hauled us and our supplies easily. But we ended up with a mid-sized Saturn sedan with almost a full tank of gas. I didn't start the engine. I didn't want to alert any zombies that were there. Tracy and Max helped me load the trunk with supplies. Once we were safely in the car, I started the engine and we drove away, and I watched the little store grow smaller in my rear view with a growing sense of unease. But I knew we needed to make it to that radio station and see if there were other survivors. We drove for miles in silence and without seeing corpses or any residual carnage from the outbreak. I could almost pretend that I was out with friends for a nice Sunday drive through the country. Well, almost. And then we ran into a strip of road that was clogged with cars and corpses and roaming animals. Some of the vehicles had burned and others still had passengers inside, as if they had tried to remain in the safety of their cars, only to die in them. I stopped and surveyed the blocked road. Dogs, raccoons, possums, and a few cats milled about, feasting on corpses and body parts strewn across the pavement. It was close to noon, and the smell was more than unpleasant. We couldn't drive off the road and get around the cars. The ditches on either side were far too wide and deep for the Saturn, and none of us wanted to walk under the circumstances. And that meant that there were only a couple of choices left. Get out and scare away the animals so that we could push cars out of the road, or turn around and head back. I took out the map and checked the roads. If we turned back, we would have to go all the way back to where we knew there were clogged roads and zombies. Then it would take us several hours out of the way, and, well, we didn't know if there were working gas stations in that direction. As it was, we had enough fuel to get to the radio station the way we were going. I turned off the ignition and Jesse gasped, sitting forward. He uttered his first words since we'd met. "Why do you do that, mister? Don't you see the animals and the dead people out there?" His eyes were wide. Max patted his shoulder and assured him that we were safe. And deep inside, I hoped Max was right. "Tracy, I need you to stay here with Jesse. Max, I need you to come with me and help me push some of the cars off the road so that we could get through this mess." I stepped out, machete in hand, and I popped the trunk to retrieve my rifle. Max joined me. He took Ace's shotgun and ammo. "What about your sword?" I grinned at him. Work smarter, not harder, my friend. Gun first, then sword." He loaded the gun and then crammed the remaining shells into his pocket. I took aim at a very large raccoon. He was tearing into the throat of a man and snarling at the other animals who came too close. I felt a blankness inside me as I pulled the trigger, and the raccoon fell. There was no guilt, no remorse, no sorrow or fear. I was devoid of feelings. It had to be done for all of our safety. It was a chore to get it done, mark it off the list. Nothing more. A month before, I could not have done anything of the sort. But the world changes, and we change with it, don't we? Some animals scattered, running off through the pastures on the right or into the shrubs on the left. Max and I walked between the vehicles to make sure we were in the clear before we started pushing cars out of the way. With 3 cars out of the way, we were faced with another decision. There were rotting corpses that needed to be moved before the other 3 cars could be maneuvered off the road. We could drag them to the sides, or we could run them over. At that moment, I motioned for Tracy to come help us. She wasn't happy about it, but she was as determined to get to the other survivors as Max and I were. So she grabbed the woman's arm and tugged, and the arm ripped off, and Tracy bounced on the pavement. The arm flew into the air and landed across her face. Tossing it aside, she cursed and wiped herself off. I helped her to her feet again, unable to hide the smile on my face. I'd rarely heard a woman use so much profanity in a single breath. We moved the bodies without much trouble after that. Tracy helped move the other cars, and we were soon in the Saturn again, weaving through the opening we just made. As we moved on to an open road again, I realized that I had not been nearly as affected by the corpses as I had been before. It hit me that I was becoming used to the sight of mangled, rotting bodies. Something inside me had calloused over, hardened, or just plain died with this new reality. And it scared me how quickly it had happened. And I wondered if the others felt the same way, but I didn't ask them. Some things are too personal to talk about with strangers, even if we were the only living people around. The radio station came into view a short time later. It was a flat, square little building out in the middle of a large field. "Yeah, that's it right there," Max stated flatly. I nodded and turned onto the road. It looked as if someone had burned a large clearing around the building, and part of the bricks had been scorched too. The burned ground had been raked clear of debris, and white granules had been scattered around the perimeter. Tracy looked at the white granules. Odd. It looks like they salted the ground. "Well, why would they do that?" I asked her. Whispering, Max said, "To keep anything from growing on it." The door opened a crack, and a man's face appeared. "Who are you?" I stopped and held out my hands. "Well, we heard your looping broadcast. We're survivors from that way." I jabbed my thumb in the direction we had just come from. The man eased the door open and spotted the wrap on Jesse's leg. "Is he sick?" No, he cut it in a car in a junkyard. We're all clean." I waited patiently. Deciding that we were okay, the man opened the door and motioned us inside. Tracy went first, obviously agitated. Max and Jesse followed. "I'm going to pull the car closer to the building." I pointed to the Saturn and turned. "Just hurry. Animals tend to come sniffing around at dusk." And the door closed behind me. I took in food, drinks, and the men introduced themselves as Ryan Henderson and John Trevine. And John seemed to be the leader. He seemed to be a lot more cautious than Ryan. They were glad to have our supplies, but I'm not sure whether our company was welcome or not. Neither man seemed very friendly, especially not John. They told us about the creeper vine and how they burned it off the building so that they could go in without it attacking them. I shuddered. People, I knew that they would turn with the virus. Animals too, but plants? The thoughts of zombified foliage bothered me more than it should have. I'd walked through woods, leaped into bushes and against trees, and now I wouldn't even be able to do that. As Ryan had said, at dusk, I heard animals outside scratching at the bricks, the doors, the bare ground. Jesse huddled close to Max as the fights broke out, and animal screams filled the night. I took to the small room away from the others. I wanted to sleep and figured we were safer there than anywhere I'd been so far. I woke up with Tracy curled up at my side. She hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to me since arriving at the radio station. She was beautiful. Maybe the only beautiful thing left in the world now. And I watched her sleep for a while, quietly wondering what could have been if we had met before the world changed. She probably would never have acknowledged me. We spent the next day bringing in more supplies from the car and planning a run to find gas and more food. We also needed to look for others. Ryan was up for it, but John was not. He said we didn't have enough room for more people in the little radio station. He was right. It was crowded with only the 5 of us, but we still had to look for other survivors. We could worry about another sanctuary afterwards. We had a brainstorming session. Everyone named off places they knew in the area, stores, warehouses, bunkers. And finally, Max exclaimed, "I know where we could dig in and stay safe. It would hold all of our supplies we'll need. The power can be run from the Jennies too, at least for as long as we have fuel for them." He was grinning wide. It was the most animated I had seen him so far. Brushy Mountain, the state pen. We'd all heard of it naturally. It had closed down years before and was just sitting on that mountain, defunct and sealed off with a wall and industrial gates. For the first time since the world had spun out of control, I felt a true spark of excitement. Brushy Mountain was huge. A whole town could live inside the compound. Tracy complained that she had a migraine and made her way back to the little room to lie down. I took her aspirin from the bathroom cabinet. She took them and curled up on the floor under the wobbly little card table. I told her that Jessie would stay and keep an eye on her while the rest of us went on a short supply run. She only nodded. The first gas station we stopped in still had electricity, and I wondered how long before the electric was gone, before all our modern technology went bust and threw us back to the Dark Ages. We strapped fuel jugs to the roof of the car with bungee cords and filled the tank. All the canned food went into the trunk. There wasn't much, but every little bit helped. At least, it gave us some hope. I pulled into the parking lot of a supercenter. It looked like a slaughter had taken place in the parking lot. Mutilated corpses had reanimated. Most were so torn apart that they could no longer walk, but instead pulled themselves along with their hands. Some were stuck inside vehicles, thrashing and screaming, leaving smears of blood and tissue on the windows. The virus had apparently wiped all their memories, and they were trapped, clueless as to how to open their car doors. But I was glad of it. If they were in their cars, they weren't going to pose a significant threat to me or the others. Our goal had been to raid the food section of the store, and we ended up leaving without ever getting out of our car. We could see the zombies inside the store. It was worse than at Big Dale's store back home. On our way back to the radio station, we spotted a zombie wandering close to the trees. There were none in the big field, so we thought we were safe. We carried in the canned food and the bottled waters from the gas station and spent a long time rearranging the shelves and cabinets to fit it all in. We had cold vegetables and light bread for dinner. Tracy declined, saying her stomach was upset and that her head still hurt. She felt mildly fevered, but, I didn't think it was anything to worry about. At least not then. That night I slept in the little room with Tracy. She had barely been out of that room all day and was still sleeping when I went in. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The animal sounds were more aggressive than the night before, and their fights were louder. Not long after I finally drifted off, I was startled awake by Tracy. She had closed the door and stood naked before me. If she had been beautiful, fully clothed, she was exceptionally gorgeous naked. She then put her fingers to her lips. "Shh, they're sleeping." She knelt beside me. "It's the end of the world, you know." She leaned over and her long hair fell around my face like a curtain. "Well, the world we know anyway." I reached up and ran my fingers down her back. The heat from her body was startling. I didn't want to take advantage of a woman with such a high fever. Why don't you put on your clothes and let's just rest tonight? You're not well, Tracy. She kissed me and I kissed her back. I didn't want to take advantage of the situation, but I am just a man, sick or not. I knew I would only be able to resist her for a little while longer. Breaking the kiss, I tried to push her up and away from me. She grabbed handfuls of my shirt and pulled close to my face. It's the end of the world, and I might die the next time I go out there. I like you, and I want you. The silky, sexy tone of her voice and her nude body pressed fully against me sealed the deal. She was right. Either one of us might die at any time. We should find solace with each other for as long as possible. We fell asleep in a naked, sweaty, satisfied tangle. And a knock at the door woke us. She groaned and rolled away, pulling a shirt over her body. I dressed and opened the door a crack. Ryan was there, fear in his eyes. Look out the window, but don't open the blinds. Just peek, and for God's sake, be quiet. And I did. There were zombies everywhere. I went to look out the smaller windows. The building was surrounded. We were stuck inside. There was no way to the car, and even with all our ammo, we'd never be able to clear a path. Max said, "They must smell us. They're trying to locate us by smell. It's the only explanation." And John whispered, "They attack anything that makes a sound too, or anything that they bump into, like cars or fence posts, just anything, trees, whatever. So stay quiet and maybe they'll go away." At that time, I went back to tell Tracy. She was still naked and squatted in the corner with a snarl on her face. Her hair hung in clumps around her. The sweat slicked her body, making it shine in the dim light. But the worst was her eyes. The blue was so dark it looked black, and the whites were non-existent, hidden behind a film of blood. I looked back to the others, and they were oblivious to my plight. Was she turning? Had she been bitten before I met her? I mean, I would have seen the marks. Not bitten then. My mind raced. I could think of nothing. I stepped outside and eased the doors closed, hoping against hope that she was only fevered from a cold or allergies or anything but the virus. And I whispered, "Tracy?" She snarled and placed her hands on the floor by her feet. She was crouched and ready to pounce. There was no recognition in her eyes. "Tracy, it's Truce. Surely you remember me. You're fevered. You're sick. I'm going to try to take care of you now." And I motioned for her to come to me, simultaneously hoping she would, and dreading what I'd have to do if she did. By then it was obvious that she was indeed turning. She snapped her jaws at me and growled as she stood straight. I reached behind me for the doorknob and turned it. With a sob stuck in my throat, I stepped out of the room and shut the door as she rushed toward me. She hit the door hard. The sound was immensely loud in the quiet. Ryan gasped, and all of them turned to me. 4 horrified expressions staring straight at me. John was the only one who moved. He ran to me. "What the hell? I told you to be quiet." She hit the door again, screaming. She's... I couldn't finish the sentence. "Oh, fuck no." John grabbed my machete and shoved me from the door. He looked at me. Idiot. He yanked the door open, stepped back, and as Tracy came screaming at him, he swung, taking her head with one blow. The zombies outside had begun attacking the building, and the sound of Tracy's scream had drawn them to action. The glass shattered in that little room. John shoved Tracy's body out of the way with his foot and slammed the door. "You've killed us all over a piece of tail." He rushed me. "You've killed all of us." He shoved the gore-spattered machete into my hand and turned to push the desk against the door. At that moment, one of the small, high windows erupted into the room beside me. A zombie poked his whole upper body through the opening, arms reaching blindly, jaws snapping like those of a mad dog. I didn't think, only reacted. The machete arced out and the head dropped to the floor, and almost instantly, the other windows burst inward. We would kill the zombie coming through the window, and then another would push through. The bodies were piling up. They were ferocious, without fear or remorse or any feelings at all. The ultimate killing machines. And the wave of them seemed endless. Long after my shoulders burned from swinging the blades, the monsters were still coming. Jesse had made it to the exit door. Max yelled at him, but the boy opened the door. "It's clear here." He looked back at Max, who ran for the child. And a monster snatched Jesse from the open doorway, and Max leaped after him. John slammed the door shut. "We have to get out of here," I yelled to Ryan and John. Neither responded. The influx of zombies kept coming, and we kept killing. Several minutes passed, and I heard Max pounding at the door. Jesse's squeal of terror and pain turned my insides to ice. I moved to open the door, and John put his bat in front of my face. "I'll kill you if you do it." His expression said he wasn't only making an idle threat. "But he's still alive." "And will turn sooner or later. He'll turn." John shook his head at me and turned to help Ryan kill another intruder. Max pounded on the door again. His voice was weak and he was out of breath. I grabbed the door. I couldn't leave him out there with those things. And he tumbled in and landed on his side. His back had been shredded and he was covered in blood. In his hand, he held the bright green hilt of a sword. The blade had been broken clean off. "You can all get to the car if you run. They're thinned out." He heaved and blood ran from his mouth. And without thinking, I rolled him onto his back. Part of his stomach had been ripped out, and Max was dead. John asked if it was true. I cautiously looked out the door, and there was a small mob of zombies huddled several yards from the car. They were still tearing at Jesse's lifeless body. The only other zombies around were at the windows, and I nodded. The men ran past me and into the car, John jumping into the driver's seat. The keys were in my pocket, and I had the split-second thought to close the door and let them die trying to get back inside. I don't know where the thought came from, but I resisted it and ran to the car as well, handing over the keys. And then all of a sudden, Ryan bolted from the car, saying only one word as he went: "Radio." The zombies crowded around Jesse turned, spotted Ryan, and gave chase. Darting into the open doorway, he was out of sight. The zombies were closing in fast. John pounded the steering wheel and muttered for Ryan to run and forget the damn radio. Running back out the door, Ryan pegged left to narrowly avoid a zombie. The shock on his face said that he was unprepared and that they had caught him off guard. John laid on the horn and screamed, but it was too little, too late. They had Ryan on the ground, ripping at his face and throat and stomach. John then threw the car in gear and stepped on the gas. He ran through the zombies. Their black blood sprayed the car. Their bodies burst under the tires. Ryan was in that carnage. Just thinking about it made my mouth water. I was confused. John screamed and backed up only to run into the remaining zombies again. His scream grated at my nerves, and I wanted him to stop. Finally, he did. He steered us onto the road and away from the radio station. My head pounded, and sweat poured from every pore. I crawled into the back seat and curled up. I remember John threatening me, cursing me, wishing I had died instead of Ryan. The ride seemed endless. And then I slept. I woke up and saw that John had left me in the car. John. Yeah, that's his name. I'm having trouble remembering things. That's why I started writing it all down in this notebook. A man brought me inside this building. He was screaming at me, and I think I might have killed him. He's dead out there in the hall, and I'm the only one here, so yeah, I guess I did kill him. I'm turning. I know I am. I don't have the balls to shoot myself and end it. Not before I'm done writing anyway. There has to be some record of what happened here and why. If you don't like it, tough shit. I hate you. I'm sorry, it's the virus. I don't know how long I've been sick. And I'm hungry. But I'm angry too. I'm so fucking angry. If you're reading this, you should be very quiet and very still. No sudden movements. They tend to annoy me. May 6, 2025. The year is 2025, the month is May. At least, that's what the little blinking digital readout in the hallway says. The day number changes with some regularity, so I'm assuming it's correct. My name is Adam. I've been out of cryostasis for less than a week. I was part of an experiment that started in 1975 when I was 30 years old. The first men to be cryogenically preserved for future reanimation. I mean, who wouldn't want to be part of such a world-changing experiment? An experiment overseen by the best and the brightest scientists of our time. Teams of doctors, backed by the government of the United States of America. Nothing could go wrong. I spent years of my life, devoted every minute possible, to the study of cryostasis. Well, nah, you know what? That's about as far as I carry the bullshit. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to tell the truth. The truth is, well, I barely know what the hell cryostasis is. I could barely pronounce it. I'm a soldier, and I was part of an experiment. And I did go into it willingly in 1975, just after I turned 30 years old. That part was true. My reason is mostly to do with the money offered by the government. I'm not altruistic enough by nature just to wave my hand in the air volunteering for experiments that can make a better world for future generations. Or such nonsense. I care about the here and now. Which is ironic, considering my here and now is no longer where it was. I'm 50 years in the future, and I barely recognize anything I see. The idea was that 50 of us would volunteer. Our families would be well compensated and never want for anything. And we would wake up 50 years in the future and be studied for the rest of our natural lives. What no one figured on was the apocalypse happening while we were on ice. The deep underground facility in Washington state is enormous. We were awakened in groups of 10 over a 5-day period. I was in the first group. And everything seemed to be running automatically because there weren't any doctors and scientists running around anywhere like we thought there would have been. Like they thought too, back in 75. Come to think of it, I guess none of those same doctors and scientists would even be alive today. And if they were, they wouldn't be able to do much. It takes a while for your body to start behaving like your own again after half a century of stasis. But I finally feel like my old self again, and I'll start exploring the rest of the place. And the world soon enough, I hope. We're all just waiting for the green light from someone in charge, and surely they'll show up soon.
or have one of their autopilot programs tell us what to do over the PA system. And I hope they hurry the hell up, though. The MREs are running low in our dorms. May 20th, 2025. Things are getting worse here. The food is running short and the other men are getting restless. I'm getting restless. I don't know how long we're expected to stay in our dorms and not enter the rooms with do not enter signs on them. There have been no announcements over the PA system and no doctors have shown up. I don't really know any of the others, and from what I can tell, they don't know each other. I wonder if the lack of supervision is part of the experiment, just to, see how we would react. If we would group up on our own and form a plan to get out, get food, or even get help. But doesn't much matter. I'm going to find a way out of the facility tomorrow. No one else said it out loud yet, but I know they must be thinking the same thing as me. What if they stuck us underground and forgot about us? I, for one, am not going to sit here like a rat in a cage and starve while waiting on some white coat who might or might not ever show up. May 29th, 2025. Well, it didn't take long to figure out we weren't in the same place we were 50 years ago. Some of the men decided to stay in the facility. They were convinced the waiting was part of the experiment, and like 5th graders anxious to pass a test, they refused to leave. Of course, none of us tried to force them to either. I was ready to go alone, but apparently a few others had the same idea, and I met up with them in the main tunnel. We followed the slight incline until it flattened out, and then we followed the signs on the walls. Flashlights were little good in the complete darkness where there were no overheads, and I thought it was a shame they hadn't cryogenically preserved the power from a few hundred batteries. Now, we didn't inspect the closed off and empty rooms, or the smaller side tunnels as we went. We simply wanted out of the place, just to breathe fresh air and to see the sky again. Screw the contracts we'd sign. My plan was to reintegrate into society, disappear from the doctors and scientists and the government overlords to live as normal of a life as possible. Now, after walking an impossibly long time, it might have been several hours, or it could have been a whole day. There was no way to tell for sure without any clocks, watches, or sunlight to gauge it by. We came to the widening mouth of the tunnel. Stopping 100 feet from it, we looked at each other and then back at the opening. All but 2 of us ran for freedom, whooping and yelling excitedly like a bunch of kids at the last bell of the school year. But you see, something felt wrong about the dusky scene beyond. Maybe it was a vibe, a smell. I didn't know for sure, but I hung back wishing the others would be quieter. What if they drew unwanted attention? But from what? I wondered, taking a few steps back towards a support pillar. I flicked my light off and the other guy did the same, moving toward the opposite pillar. I lost him in the inky darkness and waited. I waited to see if the runners actually made it out. And in my mind, I could imagine spotlights flipping on, pinning them to the grass and sirens blaring into the open air. And if any dared to keep running, gunshots would ring out. First warnings and then the real deal. But instead, I heard the distinct sound of a chain-link fence rattling violently, and then curses and angry shouts from the group. And slowly, I made my way to where they were. A chain enclosure had been erected over the outermost part of the entrance. Perhaps to keep us in, I wondered. Had they really forgotten about us? The enclosure was about 60 feet long by 40 feet wide, and about 12 feet high. The wire had been stretched tight, and there were no loose places to push through. But there was a small gate close to the rock face of the tunnel entrance. It looked more like a doggy door than a gate designed for human use. A chain and padlock secured it from the outside. Using the butt of a flashlight, I beat the padlock until its rusted shank gave way, and I opened the gate. To fit through, I had to shimmy through on my belly, and the others followed. The surrounding area was covered in waist-high grass. Abandoned military vehicles stood as rusting husks, mostly camouflaged by the wild growth. The skyline at the western mountain was stained an ugly blood burgundy color as the last of the daylight disappeared and clouds moved in, and the air was deathly still. I had a cold chill run up me, in spite of the warmth and lack of a breeze. See, something wasn't right, and I know the others felt it because they stopped hollering and yelling and running. It was a smell. Definitely a smell that had set off my internal radar. Outside, it was more pronounced, and as soldiers, well, we all knew that smell. Walking in a defensive military formation, we made our collective way south, toward where we had come from decades ago. Not only had we been sealed in and forgotten, it seemed the world had been abandoned and forgotten. The gravel access road had been choked by weeds and grass and small new trees, and the whole thing stank of death. It was that pervasive, rotten smell that once you smell it, you never forget it. Stopping on a rise, we gathered to look toward town, but we saw no lights. Not a single light anywhere. One of the group suggested we keep walking until we reached the town we knew was supposed to be there. May 23rd, 2025. We found the town, or rather, what's left of it. Looks like fire has ravaged every building and almost every house. There's nobody left, though. The buildings that weren't gutted by flames years ago sat with boarded windows and blocked entrances. There was no getting inside. But we weren't alone. I didn't see anybody, but there was definitely somebody ambling around in the trash-choked back alleys and out in the woodlines surrounding the town. We needed to find food and somewhere to shelter, but we couldn't do either in town, so we decided to keep heading south. May 26, 2025. I was right. We weren't alone. We ran and hid where we could. Those things couldn't be real. That's what I thought, what I had hoped, and what I wanted to believe, but they're real all right. I don't know what they are, but they used to be people. Soldiers, to be precise. At least, if I were to judge by their tattered uniforms and the dog tags dangling around their necks. June 3rd, 2025. I've seen enough in the past week to make me doubt reality. I don't think I ever woke up from cryostasis, and I think maybe I died and went to hell. There's great hordes of shambling humanoid monsters sweeping across the land like a scourge, destroying and devouring every living, normal thing in their paths. Those things are dead, or should be dead, and in their graves, but they're not. They walk with half-rotten guts spilling out of their wasted bodies, flies all around them, and they never stop, never sleep or drink. They just keep moving forward, towards noises, even after the maggots have eaten their eyes, leaving nothing but a gaping, black, empty socket. Even when their noses are missing, and their heads lopped to one side because there's no more muscle and ligaments to hold them up. And how do you kill something that's already dead? How many living humans are left? We've not seen any, and just yesterday, we lost 2 of our group. But if there were no women left alive, what good would it do us to stay alive? If there are women, what good to procreate? Nothing could survive this hell. Nothing. June 27th, 2025. There are only 2 of us left alive, and we found out that if one of us is bitten by those slavering monstrosities out there, that we will turn into one of them within a few days. Is it a virus? Perhaps rabies, maybe. If it is, maybe there's a cure somewhere out there. We didn't risk trying to find others who might have survived, though. We headed back toward the underground facility. That was the only safe place we'd found. The MREs are dwindling, but the facility was huge. We could search it for more. A place that big had to have more than our little stockpile of food. The eventuality of death was given. We would either starve or be killed by those living dead creatures. You know, hope. Well, she's a cruel mistress. July 4th, 2025. The little digital flickering calendars on the walls say it's Independence Day. Ironic that on the day we should have celebrated freedom, Josh and I were scrambling back through a doggy door in a fence to get back inside our underground prison. That's what it was turned into. Prison. It doesn't matter if it was designed to keep those things out or to keep us in. The end result is the same. We were trapped. The group we had left behind had a million questions, and all we could do was give them more bad news and no answers. And as we sat to a shitty MRE, which, by the way, tasted like fruit from the trees in heaven, I noticed Josh rubbing his left ankle. And a few moments later, I noticed a smudge of blood under his left heel, pooling on the white tile. The overheads flickered, the only warning before they shut off for a few hours. I asked him what happened to his ankle, already knowing or at least suspecting the answer. He said that he had caught it on a broken piece of metal by the little gate we'd entered, but he refused to let me see it when I asked. His defensiveness became violent as I continued to question him, and he ended up throwing the remains of his meal at me before stomping out of the room. I had a moment of doubt, but even then I suspected. Soon none of us would be left. A virus, after all, spreads quick. I'll die without ever having answers to any of my questions about what the hell happened to civilization. This is Russ Engel, logging my findings for today. November 14th, 2175. Skeleton remains in the underground facility in Washington have been sealed and are loaded for transport back to my home base facility. The entries in the journal explain much about the state of civilization. A virus wiped out the living in the early 21st century. About that, the organization had been right. Deep underground bases or bases on the ocean were deemed the only places to survive. And so far, we found only a few survivors underground. In New Mexico, we found that people not only had survived, but had learned to live and flourish underground. So again, the organization had been right. The world I left behind when I entered Cryo in 2015 is a long one. Only vestiges of burned-out society, hulking, rusted ruins of once great civilization remain. There were roughly 500 of us put into cryostasis all across the country on the same day back then. The government was certain we would be the ones to repopulate the entire world after an impending apocalypse. A virus would wipe out civilization, they preached, or perhaps a nuclear war, but that was less likely. They recruited us through the internet, through games and websites and organizations, and yes, even us soldiers. The seekers who looked for answers to the internet's biggest viral riddles and mysteries. All of us have that much in common. All walks of life they thought were most appealing are represented with each separate group. Some were chosen because of their intelligence, others because of their hardy and healthy bloodlines. And me? I was chosen because I was a good soldier who would take orders, execute them, and never question. It seems things changed during cryostasis, though, because since I was reanimated last year, all I do is question. Not always aloud, but always in my head and heart. How did they foresee such a disaster? Had it been planned before? Say, before 1975? Was the virus manufactured in an attempt to whittle the population back down to an easily sustainable number of people. An optimal number of people, as written on the Georgia Guidestones? Or was it a fluke? A virus so evolved that even death of the host couldn't kill it, and cause the dead to walk, destroying the living, scouring the earth clean of humans. Until I have the answers, I will keep obeying my orders, going on recon missions and recording my findings in those little audio files as dictated by the governing body I suspect choreographed this whole horrible event. And until then, I'll keep killing the zombies. I mean, that's what they are, right? The living dead. I'm an antibody to the runaway virus. We all have our jobs, I suppose.
The year is 2178. My name is Russ Engel, and I haven't seen a single human in more than 5 months. You think that because you've seen all the zombie movies ever, you'll know exactly what to do. I used to joke about it with my girlfriend. I remember telling her that the day the zombie apocalypse happened, I would just take her and our cat and bolt toward the marina to steal a ship. The zombies couldn't swim, so we would all be safe in a boat. All we had to do was find a lovely, tranquil, deserted island and settle there. We joked about how we would miss the internet and Netflix, but as everyone with the "it'll happen to me" mentality, we never thought it would actually happen. But it did, and I've never felt so alone in my life. This is what happened to me. I was woken up in a panic by my girlfriend. She yanked me out of bed and said that we needed to go. As I woke up and tried to figure out what was going on, my ears finally caught on the news playing in the background. Zombies. I thought it was a bad joke, but it wasn't. I picked up the first clothes that I saw, a shirt with my name tag on it and a pair of camo pants. I grabbed the cat, my handgun, some clothes, a pocket knife, and I shoved some canned food in a bag and left. World War IV had been declared, and the countries didn't bother with nukes, since nuclear bombs were made illegal somewhere around 2050, after the Third World War. I wasn't even born by then, but my parents told me it was a good thing because these bombs could kill everyone on Earth. All countries apparently agreed to rid of them, but that didn't mean there wasn't any conflict left. And that didn't mean the absolutely no-chill countries didn't have a backup plan. The nukes might have been taken away, but biological warfare became a really fruitful field of research for Big Pharma. I'm guessing that's how we ended up here. And I say we, to try and fight against the loneliness. Because we is actually I. I didn't know if there were any other humans alive, because the only ones I've seen for the past 5 months have been dead, decaying, and very intent on eating my face in the less sexy way possible. The marina? Well, it was an excellent idea. Such a fantastic idea that everyone had the same idea. By the time my girlfriend and I reached there, it was set ablaze, so there were dead bodies everywhere, and what was left of the boats that didn't set sail couldn't be used anymore. We ran back to our car, but it was being hijacked by 2 teens who threatened to shoot us before driving away with it, and our cat. I could have shot them and taken the car back, but I didn't. They were just kids, and after all, it's just the series of unfortunate events that led me to be all alone. Seeing how the marina didn't work, we decided to go to my workplace. We found a car that was in still good enough condition to be driven. The owner nowhere to be seen. Probably a biter by now. The town I worked in was in a pitiful state.
Panic probably took over everyone, so there were many car crashes on the side of the streets. Street lamps were knocked over and fell on businesses. Glass shards were everywhere. You could see a few zombies roaming the streets, walking towards what made the most noise at the moment, which was us. I was driving way above the speed limit in an attempt to reach my workplace as quickly as possible. I worked in a research facility, so I knew I could find water, medical supplies, and everything you needed to survive, except maybe food, as long as the place hadn't been scavenged from roof to basement. But I was hoping that no one had thought about it because of the panic. We could manage for food by scavenging grocery stores and restaurants and drugstores on our way there. I knew there wouldn't be much left on the shelves, but we still took everything we could find that would be edible for a while. Canned foods, mostly. We packed the car full of supplies and finally reached the facility. It was crowded. There were a lot of biters around. Well, I could just drive my car over them, which would be good to paralyze them. I didn't want to damage the car too much if we needed it for a swift escape. I decided to park in a quiet corner and told my girlfriend not to make a sound. I knew how to get in and avoid the dozens of biters in the parking lot up front, but I couldn't do it while protecting her as well. Zombies are slow, and I run fast. I could easily make it to the employer's door in the back without them noticing or coming after me. She would be safer in the car anyway. And so, with that plan in mind, I dashed to the facility. It was abandoned as I thought it would be, but not as empty as I hoped it would be. I couldn't shoot my gun in fear of alerting more biters to my presence. I had to break a chair in one of my colleagues' offices to have a weapon. I used the chair leg as a bat and swung at every single biter that came at me. I even had to crush one's head in by slamming the door repeatedly against its skull. The sound it made as the cranium split to pieces and brain juices flowed out was pretty nasty. I couldn't find any medical supplies, but I saw enough bottled water to last us a week. I found the trolley we used to transport boxes and packed it up with the water. As I was making my way out, I was jumped by a biter. His nails dug into the flesh of my chest and tore through my shirt, ripping my name tag and the right sleeve in one fell swoop. I managed to push it back inside the room it came out of and closed the door. I felt the disgusting, slick warmth of my blood as it trickled down my chest and soaked my shirt. I cursed under my breath and tried to ignore the sting. If I wanted to alert the zombies to my presence, me smelling like a fresh meat buffet was the best way to do so. It was at that point I rushed out and dashed to the car, pulling the trolley with me. My girlfriend opened the door, and we shoved the 24-pack bottles of water and medical supplies on the back seat before driving away as fast as we could. Pieces of my shirt were still inside that lab, but I was alive. My chest burned, but I was alive. Once we were far enough, Maya cleaned the wounds, and we threw the whole shirt away. I changed quickly into the clothes I had in my backpack, one of the only things that hadn't been stolen with the first car, and we drove down the highway, avoiding discarded cars and stray zombies as much as we could. And we survived. For a little bit. If you really need to know how I lost her. Well, I could tell you it wasn't pretty. I could tell you that we drove off following the East Coast down to Georgia, hoping to get to Florida. That we hoped to find a boat somewhere. And we searched. God, did we search. We even went into private residential districts close to the water to try to find yachts, but they had all been stolen or destroyed. I would have loved to tell you that I tried to save Maya, that I was a hero, that the world would let me keep her. But it's not what happened. She, luckily, wasn't ripped apart by zombies, to my knowledge at least. But as we persevered down the Georgia coast, we ended up meeting with a group of humans who blocked off the road we were following. They probably stopped each and every car that passed there, and stole whatever still had worth on this god-forsaken rock we call Earth. They decided the vehicle, all of our supplies, and Maya would be better with them, and that I needed to go. They took everything from me. My girlfriend, the car, our supplies, everything. I tried to tell them that I was military, and they could use my expertise, but it didn't work. I tried to fight them, but I was shot in the shoulder, and I had to pretend to pass out on the side of the road so that I could survive. This was a coward move, but what else could I have done? Even as ex-military, I knew that both our odds were terrible if I kept butting heads with them. They took her, and I was left for dead. I prayed for her safety, but I knew that in this world, no one was safe. I couldn't shed a tear for her. I couldn't save Maya, so I had no right to cry for her. I abandoned her because I would have died if I didn't. When you're placed in a position where your survival is paramount, you're willing to let go of many things that you hold dear. I kept on living. Human survival instinct is a damned thing. The world around me had fallen apart and gave no signs of ever going back to normal. At this point, it was either adapt and survive, or kill yourself. I had to give up on finding a boat as well. My new priority was to patch up my shoulder and, you guessed it, survive. I redirected myself inland, deeper in Georgia. I needed to get to a hospital to find some medical supplies, and with my clothing smelling like a buffet for zombies because of how drenched in blood they were, I desperately needed to change. There would most likely be clothes somewhere in a hospital, lost and found stuff maybe. The problem was that, to reach the hospital safely, I needed a car. Walking there with blood running down the length of my body was not a good idea at all. The only positive is that the zombie apocalypse are not like in the movies. Once the zombies cleared an area, you might meet one or two, but not large groups. You never see herds of zombies unless you're in a big town, which I wasn't. I was in a rural area of Georgia, so there weren't many biters to fight. I tore my shirt and tightly wrapped the scraps around the wound as tightly as I could. I wished that I had some pain meds, but I had nothing with me. Nothing to my name, as I was stripped of everything when that group attacked me. With every last bit of energy I had, I walked through streets and streets trying to find a working vehicle. You'd be surprised how many abandoned cars there were, and how very few of them were in driving condition. It took about 25 minutes to find one, and another 15 to get the car to start without keys. But that was nothing compared to the scare of a biter suddenly tapping my window. I could smell its fetid breath as it growled at me and rolled up the window as quickly as I could, nearly slicing the zombie's fingers. Yeah, that was an old car. No automatic in that one, but it's whatever. I just needed a car to leave as quickly as I could. I stared at the flesh-eater for a few seconds, somewhat mesmerized and disgusted that something falling apart like this could still walk. One of its eyes was gone from its socket. More than half the skin on that side of the face was either in tatters or gone. I could see the zombie's dry, gray tongue lolling sideways inside of its mouth. The hole in its big cheek so big, you'd think this one died by a missed gunshot wound to the mouth. Many people chose that way out, forgetting that they too would rise after death and increase the zombies' population problem. I also realized how I kept referring to zombies as it, as if they hadn't been human at some point. Zombie movies told me there were no cures, and I guess it's easier to shove a knife through their softened cranium when you don't think of them as humans. I started the car and drove away, leaving that disheveled mess of a rotten human being behind me. This man, this zombie. It did have a family too at some point. I wondered briefly if they all died together, or if, like me, they'd been separated. Separated or not, though, there were so very few humans still alive. It was hard for me to believe that anyone could survive alone for this time, and I didn't think I would last either, what with blood still trickling down my body. As I drove, I checked for hospital signs. Once I found one, I kept following them and found a small clinic. I had no idea where I was, but this was definitely a hospital, or at least part of it. The bigger facility might have been a little further, but I honestly didn't feel too good with all the blood I lost, so this would have to do. I quickly searched the car for a weapon, and I was pleasantly surprised to find a bat. Luckily, too, the gunshot wound was not on my strong side. I hoped that this place wasn't infested, and did a little prayer as I got out of the car. The parking lot was pretty quiet, except for biters on the west side of it. However, since they're pretty slow, I managed to make my way to the clinic without being bothered. I took the time to close and lock the doors as well. Then I turned around and looked at the reception. There was a very dry, bloody handprint on the glass around the reception desk, and the place was an absolute mess. I wasn't confident I was going to find anything worthwhile, like pain medication. This place had probably been raided many times in the past weeks. But I still prayed that I could at least find alcohol and some medical tools to remove the bullet from my wound. As I walked down the corridor, exploring each and every single room, I had hoped a biter wouldn't jump me. Fortunately, those I found were pretty slow, and not in a group. I swung my bat and killed a few biters before I could finally find what I was looking for. The room was a mess, definitely not sterile, but I found a pair of forceps. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, so I prepared something to bite in. I screamed against my gag as I plunged the forceps into the wound, looking for the bullet. While I could have left it in there, I didn't want the risk of an infection killing me. I didn't survive biters and a gang, only to die a dog's death with an infection. I saw black and white spots, and I felt cold sweat running down my body. I also felt every emotion on the spectrum before I finally found the bullet and ripped it out. I gotta say, I got lucky the wound was where it was. Otherwise, I'd probably be a dead man. I could even move my shoulders because it didn't damage any bone or anything. It was painful, sure, but I estimated a total remission to a few weeks at best. Once I was done with the bullet, I poured alcohol over the wound. I'm not a doctor, so everything I thought about remission and stuff was wishful thinking. I was doing my best with what I had. Then I stitched the wound shut as best as possible and placed the clean gauze on top of it. It would leave a gnarly-looking scar. I wasn't even sure if I stitched it right, but nobody would know anyway. After I was done, I needed to count on my luck again. As much as I wanted to lay down and rest, I knew that I couldn't. Staying in the clinic was a bad idea, but I took my time to scavenge it. I went to the lost and found new clothes in a backpack. I filled the backpack with a bunch of painkillers I found, alcohol, gauze, and stuff that could be useful to survive. I remember thinking I wanted a shower so bad, but fresh water was scarce, and for sure, this clinic was sort of likely drained. Finding water was the most challenging thing to do after the apocalypse. For the first few weeks it was fine. A lot of places still had water. But now, I'd have to go deep inland and find some houses with its own well if I ever wanted to live. And even then, I couldn't drink it because of the potential it was infected. And I had no means to boil it unless I started a fire, which, ultimately, would attract biters. I eventually what looked like a morgue and was surprised to find running water there. Maybe the morgue had its own water system. It was cold as hell, but I managed to rinse myself off a little. There was no way in hell I was drinking that water, but at least I didn't smell like dried minced meat anymore. Biters do work on instincts, and their senses are sharp. Just like sharks, if they smell blood, they're going after you. I had to bash a few more skulls on my way out of the clinic, but I felt refreshed. Not perfect, mind you, with an arm in a sling, but better than when I first entered the hospital. I finally left the clinic, managed to avoid most biters, and returned to the car I stole from the side of the road. After that, I moved several times. I tried to stay close to the grocery stores and places where I could find water. I've been surviving on Gatorade and gas station bottled water for a while, but these too eventually ran out, and each time I depleted my resources, I moved on again. And after a while, you stop counting the days. I estimated that my stay in Georgia was about 4 or 5 months. The lack of food, the increasing number of biters, the lack of social interactions were all reasons why I needed to move. My shoulder was healed but remained somewhat stiff. The scar was as gnarly as I thought it would be, and sometimes it would still hurt. I was alive, but I was hanging on by a thread. I thought maybe I just needed to go back to Plan 1. Find a reason to live. If I went to the sea, I could fish and survive. I could also stay close to the shoreline, so whenever I needed to refuel my water and gas, I'd be close enough. With that in mind, I decided to leave my current location. I hadn't talked to a human, a live one, in more than 4 months, and I felt like I was going crazy. But somehow, I still wanted to live. Another month passed before I could will myself to move. My will to live was waning, but I still struggled. I moved from house to house, surviving on what little pittance I could find in them. My stomach growled louder every day, and I felt weaker as well. It wasn't enough food. I was getting hungry and tired of eating canned peaches and questionable tuna. I needed to escape, but where? There wasn't any news channels, radios, or anything letting me know if there were other humans alive somewhere. Staying in place had proven safe, but incredibly lonely, and I was slowly fading away. I needed to do something. That something I needed to do came to me when I woke up with a Z's breath over my face. It somehow found its way inside the house I was hiding in, and was a fraction of a second ready to bite my face. I managed to push it back and get up. Grabbing the machete I always kept close to me, I buried it deep into the biter's skull. It shook once, twice, before I pulled my blade back and watched it fall to the ground. But when I looked outside, I saw something I hope I'd never have to see. It wasn't a herd like something you'd see in a movie. It wasn't drowning in the street or absolutely inescapable. But I had rarely seen more than 10 to 12 zombies at once. I could count at least 50 just from the bay window. My safe place wasn't as safe anymore. And the front door was not an option. I didn't bother picking up food on my way out, only my weapons and my backpack. Why? Because if there was one biter inside, that meant there could be more, and they were coming. I ran out the back door as fast as I could, and I had to fight with everything I had to pass through a backyard full of zombies. I think I swung at 4, maybe 5 before I had to give up and just run. They might not be fast, but there's only a need for one to grab you by the collar to sign your death. I didn't plan on being a zombie's all-you-can-eat buffet. Unfortunately, escaping from the back meant my escape route led directly to the forest. There's something else that scary movies don't tell you about viruses, and it's that it can affect animals, or anything organic, differently. In my lonely months of scavenging, I've seen a lot of infected animals or plants. You wouldn't believe the crazy shit I saw. I once saw a cat being forced underground by the roots of an oak. I didn't stay long enough to figure out if the tree had killed it, but I was pretty sure that the cat isn't in this world anymore. I wanted to survive this herd, but I didn't trust the trees anymore. Some of them were alive, probably because of the virus, and a forest wasn't a much safer place than in the middle of a herd. But it's not like I had much choice, though. I'd rather risk my luck with the trees than the biters. I decided I had to do it, or I'd die anyway. Armed with a machete and a couple of guns, I ran toward the forest, the wind rustling the tree leaves, and I looked at them. So far, so good, but I knew I needed to stay on my guard. I entered the forest and almost instantly felt the ground move beneath my feet. Some tree roots were moving, probably because they felt my weight. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop running, or else I'd end up tree food, if that's even a thing. I didn't want to end up buried alive like that cat, or figure out what happened to it by experiencing it myself. So I kept running. I kept my gaze on the ground, hoping to avoid any roots that would poke out. I nearly tripped on one and got lashed in the face by a branch. It missed my eye, but I could feel it swelling already. My lungs were on fire and I couldn't breathe, but I still pushed through. I was so exhausted that when I reached the stream and got far enough from the trees, I nearly fell on my face. I wanted to drink that water so badly too, believe me. But who knows what kind of dead meat might have fallen upstream. Can't drink water until it's been boiled. I heard the trees behind me, their leaves rustling as they oscillated left and right. Trees were alive, but not enough that they can chase me. I opened my backpack, got some water out and drank, then decided to make a fire. It was the beginning of the day, so the light of the fire wouldn't alert the zombies. Plus, with that stream here, I could take the opportunity to boil some water and make some reserves. Once I had 3 bottles of boiled water, I felt my stomach tightening and convulsing. I only had a can of chicken noodle soup in my backpack and planned on keeping it for later, but my stomach's complaints were unbearable. I planned on eating half now and keeping the other half for later. And I wasn't even 3 spoons in when I heard it. A bark. A dog's barking. Now let me tell you something. I've been around a lot of zombie dogs, and I've never heard them bark. My reaction was instantaneous. I jumped up to my feet and left my soup behind, then rushed toward the direction of the barking. I was armed with a machete and my gun. I just left my backpack behind. I followed the barking until I saw a small scruffy dog fighting for survival against a weeping willow tree. I felt the adrenaline pulse through my system, and when I got there I started slicing away at the branches. I could feel my stiff shoulders stinging with each swing of my blade, but I wasn't going to stop. The weeping willow entangled the dog's hind legs in those branches. They looked like they were squeezing and slowly starting to cut through. That poor dog whined and barked and bit at the tree until I managed to free its leg. And though the tree couldn't scream, I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet. It was furious that I took away its prey. I didn't think twice and grabbed the dog before running away and back toward where I left my stuff. The dog didn't bite me either, and though it was scrawny, it was still alive, and I wondered how such a small thing could have survived this world on its own. But then I thought about it. I too was still alive. I gave the rest of my soup to the dog, and it lapped it up as if it hadn't had anything to eat in weeks. I also gave it some water. It was still warm, but it was good. The dog looked like a small German shepherd, brown and tan like them, but he was still a puppy. Maybe 8 months old at best. It probably fed on trash it found. It got lucky it didn't get sick from drinking contaminated water. This dog was a survivor. I patched its wounds as best as I could, and it didn't run away. Maybe he also realized that there weren't many living things left anymore, and that we should stick together. I didn't even think twice either. I knew I was keeping that dog. It made me feel hopeful that there were still others alive. I didn't see anything alive in the past 5 months, and that dog is everything for me. It made me want to live again. And so, with my new companion, I made it through the forest and started searching for a car again. Once we found one, I planned on going down to Florida, following the East Coast. It took 6 different vehicles and a lot of patience to find a boat for my pup and myself. And it took us months to find food, water, and fuel for it. But once it was ready, we took off. Leaving the lonely land behind us was the best decision we could have made for ourselves. And I'm hopeful that we'll find other humans eventually. The world might be lonely right now, but with Willow, it's a little more bearable. The year is 2180. My name is Tyrone. The decades-long worst of the apocalypse is over, and I'm surviving, rebuilding, securing the world as we come out of this thing, hopefully, to be a better place than we were before. I'm in the military. I'm just a soldier, not an officer or one of the scientist guys who never have to leave the relative safety of their offices. Yeah, I'm a boots-on-the-ground grunt. See, we do all the heavy lifting and the legwork for the army. Now, I'm not complaining. I like my life. At least I have a life to like. Our base of operations is in the northeastern sector, what used to be Manhattan. The military cleared it with bombs and fire. They bulldozed it clean and then built up the secure facility we now have. So far, we've not had a single incident of a zombie breaching the facility. Now, I don't remember what it was like before the apocalypse, but I've heard the stories about how there were millions and millions of civilians all living in the high-rises in the cities, just packed in on top and beside each other like sardines in a can. Honestly, I can't imagine the way life was back then. It seems impossible, and I often wonder if I would have liked living in that world. I think maybe I would have. Now, there have been a few search and rescue missions in the last 5 years, but not many. Mostly, we have concentrated on developing safe facilities for government and military. Housing for the few civilians expands at a very slow rate because there aren't many civilians left. And of the few survivors, there are more every day who get infected or just die of natural causes. There aren't many medical facilities established either, so a simple injury can cause death. The past year has been pretty quiet. Quite frankly, it's been boring at the base. Thankfully, Russ and I were stationed in Virginia a couple decades ago. We had been friends for many years. He eventually left the military, but they found him stranded off the Florida coast in a boat with a very scrawny-looking dog, which is quite incredible since he would have rather starved to death than eat her. When they found him, he decided to join up again, so at least we have each other to depend on when things look bleak. I have other friends, but only one lifelong friend. The army sent him on a mission down south. There were 10 men altogether. It was supposed to be some simple, quick mission to check out a report of a warping ball of glowing light in an abandoned research facility in Georgia. The location was top secret. After 3 weeks of radio silence from the group, well, I was afraid the worst had happened. My superiors were not about to send another group down to check it out. Said they didn't want to lose another 10 men if things went sideways. I wasn't about to let it go either. Russ was my best friend. We're close as brothers, and I knew he would defy orders if the tables were turned. Now, I was warned not to strike out on my own, or I would be considered AWOL. Sitting on the threat for a week, I mulled over every way I could think of to get a rescue mission approved for the missing team. 3 days of asking for approval went by with no change. Finally, I was told that if I was so damn determined to go get myself killed looking for men who were either dead or turned, I could go on my own with the army's blessing. that I could go, but I couldn't take enough supplies to last the whole trip, nor could I take a truck or a jeep. I was allowed a shitty, ancient motorcycle that coughed black smoke and rattled like every bolt was only half tightened, and enough food to last me until I reached the first military post in southern Pennsylvania. The military posts between Manhattan and Georgia were scarce, and there was no way of knowing how safe the roads were between them. The extra fuel was strapped to the ass end of the motorcycle, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to reach my first destination. There were old defunct filling stations along the way. I planned on stopping at every one I saw for supplies. There's one thing about the old world. Convenience stores were plentiful, and so were fast food restaurants. And yeah, sometimes I think it might have been a nice way to live. Every convenience store at the tip of your fingers. I mean, who wouldn't like that? You're probably wondering too, why I didn't take Manhattan to New Jersey and cut down through that way. Well, New Jersey's a shithole. It's a mess. It's completely destroyed. The roads are all closed. So the best way to go is out through Pennsylvania, through the woods. The roads were deserted except for the lanes crammed with rusting vehicles covered in dirt. The smell of death had long ago cleared out. Even when I saw dissected bodies, there was no smell. They had all been dead so long there was hardly anything left. In Pennsylvania, I stopped at a gas station. The front wall had once been made of thick glass. It was completely open. The glass lay shattered and glimmering in the evening sunlight, sending up sparks of light from the weed-choked pavement and crunching underfoot. The shelves were mostly bare. I found tins of beans and other few pieces of jerky. After gathering all the useful supplies, I went to the back of the store and found a two-wheeled dolly and straps, and so I rigged a trolley and attached it to the fuel rack on the back of the motorcycle. It allowed me to stack 3 milk crates and carry more supplies, and another red jug of fuel. More supplies meant fewer stops between here and Georgia. The first night I drove straight through. A few times I was sure I saw shambling figures off the sides of the roads. The sickly yellow moon didn't give much light, and there were clouds constantly drifting in front of me. The next morning, the outpost came into view, and I was glad to see the squat square building with guards posted outside a high fence topped with hurricane wire. As I drove up slowly, the ground was clear of blood and guts, which was a good sign that no Z's had been there recently. I told the men there what my mission was, who I was looking for, and they gave me directions to a lab near the next military station. They would know exactly where Russ had gone because the 2 men from their lab were ordered to accompany his unit. After sleeping for a few hours, I hit the road with a few more supplies. The lab was in Upper East Tennessee area. The men had squabbled over where to put the red dot on the map, but they finally settled on a place called Irwin. They said it had been a nuclear fuel production plant about 200 years ago. It had been such a secure facility that the military had taken it over during the apocalypse, and then had brought in their lab guys, the scientists, and researchers, to keep them safe while they did their work in the southern parts of the US. When I reached the city limits, the motorcycle spit and sputtered to a crow-hopping stop, and it never started again. It was just me, my backpack, and the badly worn dolly. The city wasn't much of a city. The main street had been cleared of cars and bodies, and for the most part, it looked better than the rest of the towns I'd passed through. It was late, and there were empty buildings everywhere to take shelter in. I chose what looked like an old courthouse, or maybe a town hall. An ancient jail was attached to the rear of the building, and that's where I went. Now it took about 5 minutes to make sure the place was clear, and I blockaded the doorways, settling in for the night. Exhausted, I crawled up onto a high metal platform that looked to be an old bed of some kind. There was no mattress, just the rusted and canted platform attached to the wall. The next morning, I was out at dawn. The Z population was nearly gone, I thought. It was a good time to be alive. And, well, I hope that Russ was still alive to enjoy it. He was probably hurt and holing up in a small town just like Irwin. Or at least I hope so. Now those lab guys, they knew Russ and the rest of the team. They also knew exactly where they had gone. When I left, there were several more red dots on my map, which led to a remote region in Georgia, and I had found a better pull along, loaded with more supplies. The men had warned me to stay to the back roads, which they had plotted on the map because the main roads were overrun with dangerous thugs who would kill me for the sport, even if I didn't have a tempting cart of supplies. And there were Z's quarantined for studying on the main drag. I didn't want to risk going that way, maybe running into a zombie who had found its way out. Now hours actually turned into days, and the days bled into each other. By the time I reached Atlanta, I was haggard, I was exhausted, and I was very bad-tempered from hunger. I had abandoned the pull-along somewhere in Cowpoke, Tennessee, and only had the supplies and food in my pack. That wasn't much, and there wasn't much to be found anywhere along the way. As I walked by the vestiges of an old theme park, I marveled at the things people used to do for entertainment. Their lives had been so free from fear that they had made thrill rides so that they could feel a bit of fear. Of course, it was unjustified fear. There was never any real threat, I supposed. Could I have survived in their world? The real question, could they have survived in mine? I doubted it. They had lived pampered lives. They had been coddled far too much to be able to kill without prejudice when the shit hit the fan. And then there it was. The sound of laughter drifted on the wind as I made my way over to the center of an acre of cracked asphalt past the rides and eateries. I didn't stop, but I did listen intently for the sound again. It could have come from any direction. A few steps and I heard the sound again, followed by a loud, resounding clang as if someone had chucked two pieces of thick metal together. And I turned, and I saw a movement near the edge of the park. 4 guys, all scrawny, headed toward me. When they looked up and saw me, they yelled for me to hole up. But I wasn't in a chatty mood. They looked like the kind of trouble that had friends close by. I kept walking, and they broke into a run. Stopping, I turned on them and unshouldered my pack. It hit the pavement with a thud as I stepped toward the oncoming men, who I saw were maybe in their early 20s. Now you boys, listen. You don't want to do this, I warned them. All 4 stopped, eyed me, then each other. Then they broke out in a laughter like the sound of a cheese grater on concrete. Well, we're gonna do it, old man. Whatever you got in the bag is ours, or we'll stomp your ass and leave you for the crows. I shook my head and took another step toward them. Boys, you're making a huge mistake. I won't lie, part of me wanted them to make that mistake. Part of me was begging for them to do it. You see, I needed to let off some steam. And they did not disappoint. I guess they thought there was safety in numbers, but not one of them knew how to fight. Bully, maybe, but not fight. And I have to admit, the ringleader landed a solid hit to my face. My lip got busted. In the end, I took everything they had in their pockets just to prove a point. I dropped it a few 100 feet away. It amounted to some antique coins and paper money. It was totally useless. A pocket knife with a broken blade, and a keyring with 1 key, and a chunk of bread. Feeling less stressed, I followed my course and ended up in an open area that was maybe 500 feet away. In the center sat the abandoned research facility, just as the men at the lab had said it would be. Now I saw no weird lights. There was nothing but the building, and a fence set close to its sides that had been most likely torn down. The windows were only horizontal slits near the roof. The door was a thick metal door that was 3 feet wide and there was no window to see in or out. Circling the building, I found part of a mobile communications radio. It had been ripped apart, and all that was left was an antenna, the wires, and part of the shell. The canvas barrier, battery pack, and innards were gone. It could have been one used from Russ's unit, but I couldn't be sure. Reaching the large metal door again, I backed away to check for the warping light that had been reported. With my back to the setting sun, I saw a faint pulsing of green light through one of the slit windows. Now, the door wasn't locked, and I went inside quietly. The layout seemed like it was going to be simple at first, but the building was huge. A rendering of the floors stuck to the entry wall showed 3 floors. 2 were underground and 1 above. The hallways were wide, but the honeycomb shape of the clustered labs and rooms was pure chaos to look at. There was no way I would be able to get through all of them in one day. Ripping the facility map from the wall, I wondered if there would be a clue as to what had happened to Russ and the others. I put on my elastic head strap with the light attached to each side to light my way and keep my hands free. Pistol in one hand, map in the other. I opened the first hallway door and started my search. 10 minutes in, I would have been lost if not for the map, and I was still on the above-ground floor. Now, I had intended on heading toward the window where I'd seen the light, but ended up in the back of the building before I realized the wrong turns I had made. As I made each successive turn strictly by the map, I passed through rooms with large computers, and then rooms with hologram equipment, rooms with blood-stained operating tables, and empty rooms. Back in the hallway, I sighed with relief as I counted doors on my left. The slight thump from one of the rooms didn't register at first. Then the pulsating greenish light fell through a tall, skinny window, and I stopped. Turning to the window, I leaned close to see where the light was coming from. That's where Russ had been, and if I got to the light source, I could find a clue to his whereabouts. As I cupped my hands over the lights on my headband and pressed my face close to the glass, the green glow lit up the interior of the room. And what I saw shocked me so badly that I couldn't scream, couldn't breathe, hell, I couldn't even move for a minute. In the center of the light stood a creature that looked like a zombie, except it was much bigger, uglier. It was less rotten looking. It looked like a freshly peeled green grape when the light was on it, and like a skinless giant humanoid when the light faded. It took me until the light came for the 3rd time to realize that it was coming from the creature. The walking nightmare was emitting that green glow. It pulsed like a heartbeat, albeit very slow, very steady heartbeat. The thing took a step, sniffed the air, and turned to the side. It repeated the action, and I thought to look around the room as it lit up again. Sweat pouring from my forehead and down into my eye, my entire body was tense as I tried to peer into the corners. If Russ had been here, there had to be some evidence. The thing sniffed the air again and then turned to face me. Its eyes were the color of tarnished brass, and its black swollen tongue flicked out like a snake to taste the air. I backed away from the glass, turned my back to the door, and headed toward a hallway that would lead me around to the monster's room. After all, it was a Z, and the way to stay alive and uninfected was to avoid the threat when possible. Besides, zombie shamble. Surely I could outrun the thing if it came to that. But a gunshot or a brawl, well, that might draw another zombie into the facility. Cornering out of a room, I hit one of the wide hallways that would lead me back to the exit door. I started running. Rounding a corner, I saw blood and muck spattered along the wall at eye level. Without slowing, I looked up, following a streak of blood, and I tripped over something large. As I landed, the creature under me burst, and my hands sank to the middle of my forearms in warm goo. Backpedaling, I scurried off the thing and held up my hands. Brackish blood coated them. Slowly, I aimed my lights at the body on the floor. The name embroidered on the oh-so-familiar uniform read, R.E. Woods. Russell Engel Woods. My stomach clenched, and if I hadn't heard a distinct shuffling behind me, I would have puked. Russ's head was gone, and part of his guts was now decorating my hands and arms. Swiping them against my shirt, I got to my feet and started running again. A few yards ahead, a door stood open into the hallway. I veered into it and closed the door, flipping the bolt for good measure. I had dropped the map, or more likely it was stuck in Russ's bloated gut somewhere, and I had no idea which door to take. But I didn't have to choose. That monster screamed from the hallway, and then the door squealed. It buckled in the center and then burst into the room, clanging against the concrete floor and smashing the electronic equipment on the table. I pulled my pistol and unloaded 5 shots straight into the creature's head. Long fingers of tissue flew out from behind it and stuck to the wall. The glowing Z rocked back and forth, but it didn't fall. The scream rose to an ear-splitting pitch, and I unloaded the rest of my magazine into its head and chest. The scream then faltered, warbled, gurgled, and then died completely. Turning out the first door I could reach, I ran. Now I'm ashamed to say that I backed down from a fight, but there was no winning that one. Not at that time anyway, and I had no other choice unless I wanted to end up like Russ, a life smeared on the walls and rotting on the floor. I maneuvered through the honeycomb of rooms until I reached a hall again. Turning left on instinct, I ran toward the end, and then turned left again. Just as the short hall off from the entrance came into view, the monster lunged out of a room and grabbed the back of my shirt. The slobbering maw snapped at my shoulder, and I jerked to the side. The green light became so bright that it nearly blinded me, as the thing snapped its unhinged jaws again and again as it fell to the floor, dragging me with it. I smashed my knees on the floor, and it was clawing at my back, my neck, its black nails digging deep trenches, blood pouring and soaking into my shirt. My damn shirt that was so well made, so fucking tough, that I couldn't tear free of it. Letting the Z pull me back, I threw up my arms and twisted at the last second just before I toppled onto it. The shirt was dragged up and over my head, and I was free. The exit was in sight, and I bolted for it. The cool, humid coolness outside wrapped around me, feeling like the sticky breath of the monster. I ran until I couldn't put one foot in front of the other. And that was 2 days ago. I found another of the small military posts, but there's only one old guy here, and he hasn't been in contact with the network of posts for months. And the men stationed with him had gone in groups of 4 to the same facility and never returned. And this old man stays, hoping they'll get worried enough to send out a unit to check on him. I know that won't happen anytime soon. Now listen, I'm not leaving Russ in there with that thing. I'm going back. I'm going to kill that monster. I'm going to give my friend a decent burial. You don't leave a friend behind, no matter what.